Hi, and welcome to CASA Presents Your Mental Health. I'm Leslie McDonald. Will they be okay? The impact on children and youth 1 year into this pandemic has become a priority concern for mental health experts, and with good reason. We'll explore why in this edition of our webcast series. It's brought to you by CASA Child, Adolescent, and Family Mental Health, a respected nonprofit organization that's been around for more than 30 years in Alberta, providing assessments and treatment services for infants, children, and their families. For nearly 4 years now, they've shared their vast network of expertise and resources through the Dr. Roger Bland Lecture Series. We bring that discussion online, giving you reliable, accurate information to inspire conversation, hope, and wisdom. We have significant partners who bring support and expertise to the series as well. We want to thank Alberta Health for making this series possible, and to our ongoing partners, Edmonton Public Schools, the Institute of Health Economics, the University of Alberta Department of Psychiatry, as well as Global Television Edmonton. We also want to acknowledge the valued participation in this series from YES, or Youth Empowerment and Support Services. They'll be joining us a little later in this webcast, along with the Boys and Girls Clubs, Big Brothers, Big Sisters of Edmonton and area. Well, when we first explored the impact of this pandemic on youth back in May of 2020, the discussion around mental health was only beginning to heat up. And today, the number of studies and papers on the subject has just exploded. Will our children and youth be okay? And how can we help? We'll explore those questions from different angles with a panel discussion a little bit later. But first, our special guest expert is Dr. Jaclyn Pye. She's a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology and assistant clinical professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Alberta. She also has 18 years of experience as a practicing registered psychologist and researcher. The focus of her work is supporting healthy outcomes for all children. And a big welcome to Dr. Pye. And one of the things that I really appreciate about your work is how your work combines academia and what you see in your practice and your research. And I mentioned that there's been an explosion of research. But first I want to understand, what are you actually seeing in your own work?
It's such a pleasure to be here and to have this conversation. I have to start by just saying, if there's one thing I've learned in my practice, it's how important it is for us to have conversation and open dialogue about some of the challenges that we face. And that's what I'm hearing. And I think our youth today and their families, caregivers are worried. We're concerned about what the long-term impacts are going to be on children's development. Youth are concerned about their futures and how they're going to function in the new tomorrow, the uncertain tomorrow that they're having a hard time envisioning right now.
Boy, and that's having a huge impact. What is the research actually saying?
Yeah, as you noted, it's really exploded. We've been very fortunate that a lot of our funding organizations over the past year have really diverted resources towards understanding what's going on. What are the real impacts of COVID on development and in particular mental health functioning in our children and youth? What they're finding, and the researchers are beginning to report, is increasing concerns in our kids. We're seeing concerns with elevated feelings of anxiety. Kids are worried more, and they're not always sure what they're worried about. Kids are experiencing more depression, feelings of sadness and low energy and uncertainty about their futures. These concerns are present in little kids, even our preschoolers, certainly our elementary school age kids, and our teenagers. And our teenagers in particular are really starting to wonder about what the future looks like. Teenage years are these years where kids are really starting to imagine what they're going to be as adults, how they're going to look in their future and function effectively as future contributors to society, a society that they're not entirely sure they understand anymore, a world that they're not sure they know what to anticipate in anymore. And so experiences of depression, uncertainty, anxiety are growing. In some cases, researchers are reporting elevated rates of, say, 40% in kids who haven't had experiences of depression and anxiety. They're starting to say there's more concern here. And this isn't to say that these are kids who are suddenly clinically depressed, but rather their experience of sadness and uncertainty is elevated and growing.
And how is that manifesting itself? What are we seeing?
Well, we see kids who experience more irritability. Kids might be a little bit more edgy, not responding as well. Interactions in the home, maybe you're noticing people are becoming a little bit more short-tempered. Kids may also express their difficulty in more subtle ways. Their eating maybe has changed. Sleeping patterns might look a little bit more different. They're harder time getting to sleep. They're not sleeping as well. They're more disrupted. They may not have the same level of interest. They may not want to do things with you or engage with family activities the way they used to. You might be saying things to yourself like, gosh, we used to have a lot of fun when we'd go outside and we'd wander in the river valley. And now when I ask Johnny, he's like, yeah, I'd rather not. I just want to sit at home. And so these are the kinds of things that we might notice or observe in our kids.
You know, it's interesting. I've talked to a few people about what we're doing today. And one of the things that I keep hearing back is, kids are resilient. It's not going to be an issue. But I think that perception is changing a bit now. This pandemic's been going on for a long time, and it's going to continue on for a while longer.
Yeah. And kids are resilient.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Kids are resilient and they're tough. But at the same time, kids are also vulnerable. It's really a double-edged sword. Development is an amazing period of opportunity. Kids are growing, evolving, their brains are developing. And so we're often really tuned into the fact that the growing brain is resilient and can kind of bounce back and resume its former activity. And there's lots of truth to that. Mm-hmm. But the other side of development is that development is very progressive. And it's sort of like, if I were to use a metaphor, might be like building a house where we build one layer on the next layer. So we pour out a foundation, and that foundation is really important then for how we build that next level. What does the main floor look like? And I really want to have a good solid main floor before I start building my second story. Otherwise, I might be experiencing some difficulty. So just as kids have a lot of opportunity in their development because of that growing brain and the chance that they can just catch up, we also have to be aware that if we're missing key critical stages of development, we may have some gaps in that housing structure. And we may have to be looking back and saying, wow, if that foundation isn't poured solidly, what do we need to do to go back and shore that up a little bit? If those experiences that they need in their early years aren't provided to them, they may not just naturally have those experiences. We may need to go back and say, what's missing in that foundational layer?
And just to be clear, one of the things that we're always talking about in mental health is how important that early intervention is, that the brain starts developing right from the very beginning, but that development continues up to what, age 25?
Oh yeah, at least. We even say maybe later even. Yeah. So yeah, brains are growing and changing. And like I said, that provides us with all of this opportunity, but we need to be intentional in how we use that opportunity. I always like to say that brains don't grow in isolation. We're not developing in isolation. We develop in relation to the people around us and the experiences we have. So that house that we're building isn't just kind of spontaneously growing. It's growing in response to the builders that are working with it, right? And who's pouring that foundation? How are we planning that out? How are we tending to it? How are we giving it the time to dry? I don't build houses. I'm probably doing a terrible job here. All you house builders out there are going, no, make her stop.
But they get it.
But in terms of brains, there is this really back and forth responsiveness in terms of how we're growing and building. And so that's why even through this experience of COVID, we're really tuned in to the potential impact of isolation and lost interaction and lost experience on that building process. And we're asking the questions, not only how is that stress affecting me, because that stress can certainly affect kids and change the way that they respond to their supports, but also what opportunities are being missed that might be important and necessary to that house. What element of framing are we missing in not having our kids in the environment? And so early intervention, as you know, is important, because early intervention isn't just about saying what has to be there. It's how can we go back? How can we get in there as quickly as possible and make sure to shore up that element that might be not receiving the care it needed when it needed it.
Now you understand what can happen when things go wrong. Your background is quite fascinating, actually, and this is where your whole work with brain development happened. I mean, you were a criminologist. You worked with incarcerated youth and youth at risk. That's where you spent the whole first part of your career. And then FASD, you're an expert on FASD. You're known across Canada for your work in that area. And so you've seen what happens when brains are in distress, when you've got trauma. What's that impact on the brain?
Absolutely. Thanks for that question, Leslie. And certainly it's whenever you start to kind of poke in my real areas of interest, you get me all fired up. And my experiences have really revealed to me the impact of sort of the bigger social picture on how brains develop and how we develop and where vulnerability exists. And that when we disrupt those normal developmental patterns and when we remove sort of the expected systems of support, our brains become more vulnerable. So we realize that adversity in early childhood can have impacts that are lifelong and that continue to change the way that children interact in relationships, the way they think about themselves, and the way they make sense of and anticipate events in the world around them. We know that those same toxic or adverse stresses that a child might experience can be offset by supports. Back to that early intervention comment you made. So even while I assert the worries and the risks here, this isn't to say that they don't exist without the idea of potential for intervention and redirection. It's definitely there. But I guess we're always walking this sort of delicate balance between saying, we really need to tend to the brains. We need to be aware that the impact of adversity and stress on the brain, differences and disruptions and developmental opportunities can be long lasting. We want that message to be loud and clear. This is a real impact on our kids. This is no small deal. This is a big deal. But then I want to flip the coin and also remind us that just because it's a real thing and it's a big deal, outcomes are not inevitable. And intervention does matter, and sooner is better. And vigilance and support can make a huge difference. And that's why I'm really excited. Actually, I really can't wait till we get to the panelists, Leslie, so that I can hear more about some of the amazing things that are out there.
Okay, well, listen, maybe that's my cue. And because I do want to talk about resiliency and hope, but maybe that's something that we'll have a discussion as a group about. So we'll come back to you a little bit later. So the first person on our panel actually is Japji Randhawa. She is a recent psychology graduate at the University of Alberta, and she's also has a minor in biological sciences. She developed an interest in mental health while volunteering for an international nonprofit and seeing how the mental and physical health tie together. Japji is now a member of the CASA Youth Council, a mental health advocacy group. And so it's really good to have you start off our panel, Japji. Why did you want to be a part of the team at CYC, at the Youth Council?
Thank you for the great introduction, Leslie. I'm really excited and happy to be here. Going alongside what Dr. Pai mentioned, I think it's really great that we're having these conversations, and I think the impact is more than we can imagine. So I'm really happy to be here today. In terms of why I was interested with joining the CASA Youth Council was primarily related to raising awareness regarding mental health for our youth in the community. I think that the youth as a whole need to be more accepting of mental health, as well as I think there should be less stigma towards treatment, which, as unfortunate as it is, still does kind of exist today. And I think that's primarily what the mission of the CYC, is to go ahead, go to schools, raise awareness, educate youth about the importance of their mental health, as well as to prioritize, their mental health needs, and in the case need be, get the right treatment and resources. So yeah, I think that was what primarily drew me to wanting to be a part of the CASA Youth Council.
I mean, one of the great things about the council is you've got a group of young people who are all interested in mental health, a lot of people with lived experience themselves. And so you really kind of get a bird's eye view of what's going on out there. And one of the things that you said that surprised me is you said there's a resistance to treatment, which means we still have a bit of a ways to go. What are you seeing in that group that sort of gives you an idea of what's going on out there?
I think it's what you mentioned. It's really great because it's a team of 18, youth. And that gives us a variety of perspectives, experiences, which I think is really great, especially when it comes to creating plans, programs, and initiative to help raise awareness for the youth, because with more perspectives, you're hitting a wide array of youth that, might think one way or think another way. And yeah, I think that's one of the great things about having a larger but still intimate team. I think another great thing about that is, in relation to having different subcommittees. I think we have subcommittees that are devoted to particular, projects such as, youth education, or a social media subcommittee, which I think is a great means to kind of raise awareness, because obviously we live in a very, digital world, which I'm sure everybody can speak on, especially in the last year. So, using platforms, whether they be social media, is like a great way to connect with the youth. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you have a lot of personal perspectives on this too, because you have family, you have friends, and you've got a sister. I mean, you're pretty lucky. You graduated before COVID hit, just before. You got in just under the wire. But your sister hasn't. She's in university. You said she's in second year?
Yeah, so she's currently attending Grant MacEwan University. And what was really interesting to see was, just the distinction in the experiences that I had versus, what she's currently enduring. And you know what, I do have to kind of say this. I think no one anticipated this to happen. So for there to be a full plan for students, for, educators, it's obviously that wasn't a given. However, the certain things that I'm seeing is, the increase in stress and strain. And I think that is really impacting the youth, especially youth who are in post-secondary, just because they're in these high stress environments. They're undergoing remote learning. Therefore, I think with remote learning comes, the issues with the lack of, the quality of education, just not being in the lecture hall, being able to ask your professor questions. Also, like the confidence these students have. I think especially if you're, in your professional program and you're in your first year and it was remote, the confidence that you have in your education and your ability might be hindered, which can therefore, influence your, forthcoming education, as well as when you're actually in your field. So I think these were some of the issues I was seeing, just based on her experience. And another thing that I kind of noticed was, I almost want to say like the lack of resources available to, these post-secondary students. For regarding mental health. And I do think that goes hand in hand with, for policies and for regulations to go ahead and get processed at, in these like large institutions. It's a process. It's not just a simple, oh, we need this, let's get this passed. And I think with, this pandemic, that's, becoming more aware. So I think maybe in the future, creating like a simpler process for these regulations and policies, especially regarding mental health. I think that would be really important. Yeah, and I think even with me personally, I honestly understood the importance of, mental health when I was in school and I was under a lot of stress, academically, professionally. I'm sure everything's becoming more competitive. So these youth are putting themselves under even more pressure. So I think just having maybe more resources or just more of an emphasis in that classroom environment on the importance of mental health would be very crucial.
And this has an impact on society as a whole and on our future too, because you are our future.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm not sure if you're like familiar with the stats, but even within the last year, like profits related to alcohol or substance abuse drugs have all increased, and it's just how youth are coping. And I don't think that's particularly just youth. I think that was society as a whole, where you saw the sales just skyrocketing, and I think that's almost kind of like worrisome, especially when it comes to youth, because I think if this persists, then that becomes their kind of interpretation of healthy coping, which isn't healthy coping. So I think that's also something to consider, that during the pandemic, that was what youth or society in general was doing to kind of cope with their mental health issues or adversity.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit later, but I'm going to move on to our next panelist now. She is Bethany Zellant, and she's a wellness practitioner and trauma therapist at YES, which stands for Youth Empowerment and Support Services. She's trained as a psychotherapist with 9 years of experience serving homeless folks in Edmonton. Her focus is addiction recovery and healing from generational trauma. A huge welcome, Bethany. Thanks for joining us. First of all, I want to get an overview of YES and who it serves.
Yeah, so YES has been around in Edmonton for the last 35 years. YES stands for Youth Empowerment Support Services, and our model has changed in response to the changing needs of youth in our city. So we currently have 5 programs in which we are able to serve our youth. We have an overnight shelter, a daytime shelter, and 2 residential facilities that are group homes. And then we just leased the hostel on White Ave for transitional housing for our kids. So we serve youth 15 to 24, and our demographic is kind of everyone and anyone. But we do see a lot of new immigrant kids who are struggling in being in the in-between, being first generation here. We see a lot of kids who have gone through the child family services system, and a lot of kids who fall through the gaps where they're not bad enough to access other services, but they don't have the support to be at home. Oftentimes what I see is parents who are exasperated with their kids and they don't know how to talk to their youth. So like I've had kids who have been kicked out for playing too many video games. And instead of having a conversation with their kid, they take quite drastic action. So our model of working with youth is walking alongside them. So we kind of put aside our own preconceptions about what success might look like for them and tailor our work to be able to make their goals, their dreams happen for them. We are harm reduction and non-judgmental, so there are lots of conversations that we have with youth. I've had many conversations about birth control at 9 a.m., which are conversations I don't sometimes know that I will have. So for the last 12 months, our kids have been masked and socially distant this whole time. So whenever people complain about it, I'm like, well, if I can get a group of teenagers to put on masks and stay 6 feet apart, I'm pretty sure you're all okay. It has been interesting communicating the needs for social distancing and masks without it being taken personally, because a lot of our kids have experienced judgments for hygiene have experienced being judged as dirty, or people will cross the street when they see them. So communicating the need that it's not actually about them, it's not personal to them, it's a safety measure. Yeah, so our kids are just wonderful. They have adapted to these changes amazingly. It's been really wonderful to see. We have seen about 1 or 2 new youth every week. Since the pandemic, there's just a lot of pressure in being at home all the time with your family, increases pressures that were already there. So in our last count between 2019 and 2020, we served 691 kids.
Wow. You know, you'd be an excellent organization to talk to about how to talk to these kids, because you mentioned immigrant families or kids getting kicked out for playing too many video games. It's got to be incredibly challenging when everybody in a household is under stress, or if a kid's living on the streets, there's a lot of stress around them. They're in stress. How do you talk to them to help them? Like, how should you be listening?
Yeah, so I really like to employ a phenomenological stance, which is like the worst thing to write an essay on because you have to retype it so many times. But phenomenology is just a stance of not knowing. So I'm just really curious. So if a kid is playing a lot of video games, I'm asking, what does World of Warcraft do for you? How does it make you feel? What do you get out of playing it? Rather than having my own judgments about video games, because those types of things have existed in every generation. My dad got in trouble for reading too many comic books. It is just a new addition. And what we don't acknowledge is that adolescence is a very uniquely Western white experience. Other cultures don't have adolescence, they have childhood and adulthood, and there's a very specific rite of passage that transverses the space between the two. What we see is that our kids are youth, but they look like adults. So some of my kids are like 6'2". They look like adults, but their brains are still that of children. And the language of children is play. So we see that in video games is just, that is their childlike brain experiencing play in the same way that I would do sand therapy with a like preschool age child. I can do video game therapy with a teenager because that is their language of play. Rather than looking at it through an adult lens of that they should be using their time elsewhere, play allows their brains to grow and develop.
How much of a difference do you think it makes the fact that you're not a parent? So they might listen to you more. They might, and because I don't hear any judgment from you.
No, and that is a huge thing that I don't have any say in what my clients do with their lives because it's not my life. So that is oftentimes where parents find conflict with their kids, is that it is their expectations meeting the personality of their child. We all have like hopes and dreams for children, but we need to allow them to develop their own. So when I'm working with a youth, it is all about what they want. So even when we're talking about something like substance use, I'm asking them to filter it through their own value system. So I'm asking, like, is using alcohol or meth, does it fit with your values? If it does, that's okay. It doesn't affect me. It affects them. If it doesn't fit with their values, if it makes them do things that are not within their character, then that's something we can look at. It allows them to take ownership of their change rather than it being put upon them that I want them to change. It doesn't affect me.
Wow. And you know, that brings us to the whole concept that you and I talked about before this interview of the power of one.
Yes. Yeah, so Dr. Vincent Felitti is one of my favorite researchers because he started studying adulthood obesity. And what he found was that every single one of the participants had experienced severe childhood trauma. So he dropped his study on obesity, which is like a really big deal because he had funding and like ethics and all of that all approved, and decided to study childhood trauma. And so he developed the ACEs questionnaire, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, to see how exactly childhood trauma affects our life. What he found was on a score of 10, if you had a score of 4 or more, the likelihood of you using IV drugs went up by 11 times. The likelihood of attempted suicide went up 46 times. The increase of depression went up 14 times. If you had a score of 6 or more, he found that there was 20 years automatically taken off your life expectancy, which is a really big deal. Anything that can take 20 years off your life expectancy, we need to look at. What he found in studying the outliers of this study, the kids who did not follow that trajectory, was that they had one caring non-parental adult in their life. And that's it. It's so simple, but just one caring non-parental adult in their whole life changed the entire trajectory that they were going on. And I think that just shows how important relationships are, because we are an individualistic culture. We are confined to our immediate family, and that's just like not how humans are built. We are collectivist in nature, and we discover ourselves through relationship. Relationships are the mirror for our identity development, which is absolutely core for adolescence. That is in Erik Erikson's developmental stages. That is the point of adolescence, is to figure out who you are. And we do that through relationship, because I have never actually seen my face. I have only ever seen the reflection of my face in a mirror. And our relationships are the mirror in which we see ourselves. And if we only ever see ourselves through a cracked mirror, through traumatic relationships, we start to think that we have cracks in our faces, and we don't. The problem is in the mirror. The problem is in the trauma. It is not in ourselves.
Wow, that was just beautifully put, Bethany. We're going to come back to you in a few minutes, but I want to introduce our final panelist. It's Denisha Shivji. She's the Development and Communications Manager with Boys and Girls Clubs, Big Brothers, Big Sisters of Edmonton, and I will call it Bigs if that's okay with you. And, you know, she is what I would call a major success story. She is a present and past board member of major organizations like the Leaders Cabinet for United Way Calgary, a board member for the John Howard Society in Calgary, the Edmonton Opera, and a national member of the Aga Khan Youth, just to name a few. And I know what a big deal it is to be on those boards. She's also been recognized with a large, impressive list of awards, and among them the province's Stars of Alberta Award. And she says that she owes her life to having a big sister. And I didn't say these things, welcome, first of all. It's great to have you join us. And I didn't say these things to embarrass you, but just to show how far you can come. I mean, you're such an incredible example of how having someone in your life can make such a huge difference. So I want to start because I love your story. Every time I hear it or read it, it makes me weepy because I'm so touched by what you were able to do with it. So this started when you were 9 years old. Can you bring us through?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having me on this, and the ability to share my story, if it makes a difference in somebody else's life, is really why I do it. For me, you're right. It started when I was very young, when I was 9 years old. And to give some context, I grew up in a middle-class family with 2 parents, a younger sister, a grandmother to help take care of us. So I had a really good start in life. But when I was 9, my parents separated, as sometimes parents do. For us, that meant moving from Calgary to Edmonton, leaving my dad, my grandmother, my friends, my teachers behind. As you can imagine, that could be a traumatic experience for any 9-year-old. For me, it was especially hard because I was a shy kid growing up. So I had low self-esteem, low self-confidence. My grades suffered. I was bullied throughout my elementary, moving to a new city. I actually had to switch schools 3 times just to get rid of the pressure. And then when I moved to junior high school a few years later, when I was in grade 7, It was supposed to be a fresh start for me, new school, new friends. But in October of that academic year, just 1 month into school, my dad had a heart attack unexpectedly, and he passed away. And he was 40 years old at the time, and I was 12, and my world just spiraled downhill all over again. My mom at that time was truly a single parent raising my sister and I. We lived in poverty, in capital housing. There was times that she couldn't make it through month to month. We didn't have a lot of food. I actually had to work very early in life to help put food on the table. My mom would actually take us, me and my sister, who was asleep in the car at 4 a.m. every morning to do a newspaper route. She told me at the time it was to instill hard work in me, but really looking back, I know it was because we didn't have that much money and every penny counted. My mom at that time had the incredible foresight to enroll my sister and I with Big Brothers, Big Sisters. And like you said at the beginning, it was that agency that changed the trajectory of my life. I could have been in a very different place, I think, with the stresses and pressures that I had and that my sister had. But having a big sister in your life and someone who isn't in your family, who cares about you and cares about your future, that's what really shaped me. It increased my self-confidence, my self-esteem. I had someone I could talk to about things that I might not have wanted to put the burden on my mom because she was doing so many other things for us. So having a friend that you could talk to about things that you're going through in your teenage years, that's what made a difference for me. And not just having a big sister, but having the full-fledged support of an agency behind you that has partner agencies like with Yes and the Food Bank and the YMCA and so many others, where I actually had access to the food bank. I had access to Toastmasters workshops to help improve my public speaking skills. And I think the thing that really helped shape me was I received a scholarship through the agency, through one of their corporate partners that paid for my entire undergraduate education. And that's where I'm here because of that, because I have post-secondary education, I have a graduate degree, and I was able to come back full circle and work for an agency that helped shape who I am. Not just me, but my sister, who is 5 years younger than me. She's 30 years old. And because of the same opportunities that she had through the agency, including that scholarship, she's now a pediatrician with the Stollery Hospital, which makes me look really bad compared to what she's done. But again, both of us couldn't have done it without our big sisters, without the agency, and of course, without our mom, who has just stood by us every step of the way.
Yeah, one of the things that I've certainly learned is that when you give back, you get back tenfold. And in this case, you also learned that. So you were given, but you also gave.
Like you said, I do try to give back to the community in which I live, because I see my story is not unique. There are thousands of children and youth who are dealing with the same things that I dealt with as a child and need those supports that I had the opportunity to receive. So anytime I can help and serve in an agency in a voluntary capacity, I love. If I could volunteer for my job right now, I would do that, because I just love my job. It's my dream job. But I think what has really resonated with me is being a mentor, being a big sister. I was actually matched with my little sister 4 years ago, and she came to the program because her mom was a little sister in the agency 30 years ago and still kept in touch with her big sister, and her big sister was part of their lives. And my little sister was 9 years old, and she was just diagnosed with a brain tumor, and the doctors had given her 1 year to live. It was very unexpected. She didn't have anything leading up to that. And one of the things on her bucket list was to have a big sister, because her mom had one. And at that time, I had the capacity, I had the time, and I was willing to give. And she stayed on for 4 more years. And I think that relationship with her she was much more stronger than I've ever been. She was so resilient. If you hadn't known about her cancer diagnosis, you wouldn't think she's sick, just because she was always so happy. And she has shaped the person that I am. She passed away, unfortunately, last fall in September, after 4 years, and it has left a hole in so many people's hearts. But it also, I think, taught me, and I know you're talking to Dr. Jackie about this, about resiliency and kids, and how she held on for 4 years when the doctors only gave her 1. And it just showed me that I probably got as much out of being a volunteer and a big sister as I did being a little sister 20 years ago.
So what do you think is the power of one? What have you seen it is that has the ability to make those changes?
It's having one person care about you that doesn't have to care about you. So it's not your mom, it's not your dad, it's not a grandparent or an aunt or uncle, but it's someone who has no influence, or like has influence but has no doesn't have any say in your life, like you were talking about before. It's someone who just cares for you because you're you. It helps to develop your self-confidence, self-esteem, having someone there to guide you and seek support from when you need it. There's so much research out there that I think has been spoken to around the benefits of mentoring even before COVID. But there's a lot of research over the last year that even shows that having a big brother or big sister improves anxiety, improves mental health struggles in children and youth who are now dealing with, I think, very different challenges than they did a year or two ago.
Yeah, you're front and center right now because you've got your big lottery going on. But, how have things changed for you during the pandemic? How have things changed for the organization and for the people that you're able to serve?
For us, it's been, I think, like so many other charities, we've pivoted. We have responded to the changing needs of our families, and we've always put our children and our families first. So while our core work in Edmonton is mentoring and club programming and after-school programming, once COVID hit, we really found that families were struggling with food insecurity. They were struggling with children who were now doing remote learning, who needed additional academic support because they weren't in person seeing their teachers or other people, adults in their school. So what we really did was we changed our programming to meet their needs. So we delivered, for example, thousands of food hampers to families that needed food on the table over weekends, over evenings, and during the day. We have a youth employment program, and right now, especially for young people, it was hard for young people who didn't have connections before and networks before to find their first job. It's even more hard with the economy right now. So supporting them and helping them in their job skills, writing a CV, a resume, a cover letter, going through those motions of interviewing skills. We're just trying to help them become the best that they can be in whatever area of life that they want to. So our programming has changed. I don't know if we'll ever go back to, I know we'll go back to in-person mentoring, we will, but I think there'll always be that hybrid model now of virtual mentoring, because something that was really important to us during COVID was really that the kids got to stay in touch with their big brothers or big sisters. And we had to do that virtually just because of the restrictions. So that's been challenging in some ways, but great opportunities in other ways, because now you're not limited by geographic region, or you're not limited by finding a big brother or big sister who lives in the same community as you in terms of travel. So there's been a lot of great opportunities that I hope will stick around post-pandemic. But I think, having virtual, having immediate needs of food, of academic support, of mental health support to our families, and really partnering with other agencies and what they do well. We're not a mental health agency, we're a mentoring agency, but we work with programs like CASA and others where we do referrals for our kids who need that additional mental health support.
Okay, I want to come back to the full group because I'm hearing some common themes here. And I'm sure that as each of you has spoken, the rest of the people in the group have just been dying to jump in to add their comments. So before I get into the first question, I'd like to see if anyone would like to chip in and bounce something off of what they've already heard.
I feel like I have to raise a hand, Leslie. I don't know if that's just the wonderful world of panels these days. I was sitting here listening, and you've heard some of these stories before. I had not. And wow, what a remarkable group of people. I was really struck by, the reference to the wisdom and knowledge that is in our youth generation. And I think all three of everybody has spoken, as we think about resiliency, has also spoken about really listening to our youth, hearing our youth, being there for our youth, accepting the fact that our perspective is not going to be the same as that of the youth. And that's not just because they're younger, it's brains are different. Context is different. It's all different. It's apples and oranges. And I was really struck by that, the importance, and I think, not only everybody here, but certainly in the research, it's well supported that we really need to listen to and be there and hear what our youth have to say, and trust the fact that there is some expertise in their experience and their needs that we need to be willing to hear and to be there. And then when we listen, we can start to be that one person who can connect and respond and support them. And I just heard that over and over again as I sat here cheering in my chair. What a wonderful and important message to be conveyed.
So one of the things, Dr. Pai, you talked about listening and how important listening is. What tips can we give adults and people around us that will help make us better listeners?
I'm very passionate about active listening with adults because we're just not very good at it. We're just not. So one of the main things that I tell people when you're practicing listening is to regulate your own nervous system. Because if you are activated or if you are just waiting to say your piece, you are doing a disservice to the person who you're listening to. So right now, as I'm talking, I am scanning the inside of my body to see where my body might be holding tension, and I'm noticing how I'm breathing. And I'm still talking as I'm doing it because I'm able to do two things. That's how amazing our brains are. We can do two things. So when we are listening, we can do the same thing. I like to think of it as my ear is out here and I have an ear in my body. So my ear is hearing the words and I'm also listening to how my body is responding. One of the most powerful things that we learn in therapy is reflecting statements, which is literally where I just take what my client says and repeat it back to them. I cannot tell you how powerful it is and how life-changing it is for clients to hear their words said back to them. I don't change anything. And they're like, yes, that's exactly it. I'm like, well, you said it. But we are so often unconscious in our conversations that when we are able to offer it back to them, not only am I saying I heard you, but I'm asking for clarification. Is this what you meant? And it allows them to feel heard.
So what do we want adults to hear? What do we want governments to hear? What do we want them to hear about what that need is? About what we're going through?
In terms of the perspective of youth, just representing the CASA Youth Council, I think one of the biggest things that needs to be heard is just the importance. I think, we can't stress it enough that, this is very important, and however way we're talking about it, we need to talk about it. Whether it be a conversation, this discussion panel, any means that we have to just discuss the importance and what we can do just needs to be addressed.
I think if I can add on to that too, for me, it's about us listening to and youth telling us what they need, not adults telling youth what they need. I think it's really important, especially from when you were saying government, adults, other agencies that maybe support children and youth. I think there's a tendency sometimes for adults to be like, we know what's best for you. And I think we need to change that thinking, and we need to sit back and listen and actually hear about from youth what they need from us in terms of support, in terms of resources and tools.
Is this what you're hearing, Jackie?
Absolutely. I think that makes really great sense. I think certainly as adults, we, and as others have said, we set expectations and goals and we have hopes for our kids. And there's certainly so much that adults have to contribute to and support kids in their development. So this isn't about adult perspectives not mattering. It's just about balancing that adult perspective with a real respect for what children and youth have to say. And I emphasize children and youth. So even littles have important messages to communicate to us about their needs. And sometimes we misinterpret, behavioral disruptions, anger, irritability as something designed to, bother us, irritate us, or, a challenge to us. When in fact, it's often communication. It's often an effort for kids to say, hear me, see me, notice me, I have something I need to say. And so I think, just as everybody else is saying here, that moment to pause and really hear certainly allows the perspective of our children and our youth to come into balance with that perspective that we hold, so that we can share the floor and together we can imagine a way forward that supports them towards their goals in the context of their reality, not just ours exclusively.
You know, we mentioned earlier about how there's been an explosion of research and study into this area, and about how, you know, in the last year, technology has advanced, you know, X number of times faster than it ever has. But I don't get the sense that things have really moved forward as much as they could in terms of mental health and how it applies to youth. And I guess I don't want to, you know, get in trouble here. But it feels like the government still has a ways to catch up. What's your perspective? What are you seeing?
I mean, I think there's some great support people here and who have some really wonderful perspective, but I will definitely echo that sentiment, Leslie. I think that we have a long way to go towards supporting children and youth towards good mental health. I think we start with listening, and this is critical, and this is where we're situating ourselves today. We're acknowledging and represent, you know, speaking to the importance of having a person and a safe person in your life. But then what are we doing to make sure that those people are actually available and accessible? If we say a mentorship and having somebody there matters, then what are we doing to make sure that every family can access that if they want to? If we're saying having a therapist or somebody, a person that I can speak to, where I can be heard, where there's none of that, a baggage of parent listening with their own heart on the line too, then are we making sure that all families have equitable access to that service? Can anybody pick up the phone and say, I can get mental health services for my child tomorrow because they need them? In the same way that if my child has a stomach ache, I can pick up the phone and get them service for that stomach ache. Have we done that? No, we haven't. And I see family after family, and I suspect the folks here in the panel with me would share that sentiment, family after family who say, I have been waiting for months to see somebody, and there's no hope in sight. I can't get on a waiting list, or if I can, I can't afford it. And I really think that this is something that we cannot ignore. These are developing brains. These are children growing, and until we provide the services to really support healthy growth, we're compromising that basic building of their brains and their interactions with people that are going to impact them for the rest of their lives, truly impact them for the rest of their lives. Bethany talked about the impact of stress and adversity. This pandemic is an enormous adversity. And it's not only a single adversity, it's often multiple adversities, because people are not only experiencing social isolation and fear associated with the pandemic, but they may be experiencing loss and grief and other compounded effects over the past year. We need to increase access to mental health services, hands down.
And often that first access is through emergency rooms, hospital emergency rooms, and it's up by 75% over the past year. And often, young people get turned away, not just young people, people who are in distress. So that puts a stress on the healthcare system too.
I think too, we are looking for very easy answers to very complex questions. Mental health in youth is connected to very systemic issues, because we are looking at how immigration, how refugees are, what access to supports they have. We are looking at how our First Nations communities are able to access parenting, how distorted the interventions with child family services are in First Nations communities. We're also looking at how individualistic our culture is. We have capitalism putting so much pressure on our kids to know what they're going to do for the rest of their lives when their brain isn't even developed yet. So a lot of these, we are a solution-oriented culture. We want very easy answers that are quick and easy to facilitate, with lots of research as to why we should be putting our dollars in that bucket. And that is the hardest thing with prevention. Prevention is so hard to fund because how do I prove how many kids did not come through my doors? I can't. It's conjecture. I can prove how many kids we have gone through our system, and that's how the system just perpetuates itself. And I think that is one of the major obstacles in listening versus action is we want the action before we've even had the conversation. It takes a long time to really sit. We see this with the Truth and Reconciliation with our First Nations communities. There's so much focus on reconciliation, and we've barely sat with the truth. The fact that residential schools aren't being taught in curriculum anymore, we haven't sat with the truth yet, and we're already trying to find a solution. So I think that's something just that we have to sit with, that this is not an easy thing.
That's the challenge with these panels, isn't it? Donica, I can see you agreeing. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I think to your original question, Leslie, around is there enough being done right now? And from what I see in the nonprofit sector, I think there's an appetite. I think there are leaders in our community, whether they're corporate, government, politicians, nonprofit leaders, that see that this is an issue and that want to do something and want to help. And I think in certain spaces, there are buckets of things going on, and that may just be a communication issue, like things are happening, we're just not communicating them well to people. But I also think there's this idea of, yes, we want to help, but we don't know how. And who owns this piece of work? Is it government? Is it nonprofit? Is it corporation? I think it's a piece of everybody, but who's going to take that leadership to actually run with this, keeping in mind what Bethany said, that we have to sit with it as well. But who owns this? Who owns youth mental health? Everyone owns a piece of it, but I feel like we're doing it in isolation sometimes. So I think that's also an issue.
So is there an opportunity here? Japji, look at what you do, the Family Council, and how just that core group of people coming together with a common interest, the difference that you make.
I think there's definitely an opportunity. And I think, as you know, the previous panel members have mentioned, it's complex. It's not just, a simple A-B solution. I think there's so much complexity and so many different realms that we have to address, that this is kind of why, the youth council is there and it's put into place, so we can kind of hope to hit these things. And I think another thing for opportunity is that, to acknowledge the fact that, when it comes to physical health, it's a lot easier to see. When someone's feeling sick, they have a stomach ache, it's very easy to see, for our eyes. However, when someone's having a mental health related issue, it's much harder to acknowledge. And I think especially with youth and children, they're not even aware for the most times that, hey, I'm going through an issue that it's not even in my control sometimes, it's sometimes situational. So I think opportunity related to that. And I think that's why, the Youth Council's mission to educate is so crucial. So yeah, I definitely think there's a lot of opportunity related to education.
Something that comes to my mind often when we're having these discussions, 4 years ago when we started this series, hardly anyone was talking about it. There was a lot of stigma because we weren't talking about mental health. We were always thought it was related to one flew over the cuckoo's nest kind of idea. And look at how far we've come. So where do we go from here? Jackie.
I think we keep talking. I just heard some really great ideas. I really appreciate the conversation as well, where there's multiple perspectives, as we're hearing today, and lots of different ways to come at it. So I think we need to continue to have conversation. I really appreciate what Jaclyn said about education, and even Danica in terms of who owns it. I think these are pieces that we need to pull together and say, we not only have to talk, but we have to talk about where does this sit, who owns it, how do we take it forward? Because I think, as everybody has stated, there's clearly a need. There's clearly a demand for support and service. And when we provide meaningful support, we can make a significant difference in outcomes for individuals and support mental health. So we know the need is there. And we've also heard that there's people who have an appetite for meeting that need. We've heard that there's interest and desire, and there are services and supports that are out there. So we need to take the steps towards continuing to have conversations that increase our shared understanding and approach to accessing and receiving the supports and the knowledge that will take us in those future directions. I think I really like the fact that I keep hearing the word opportunity today, and we're talking about opportunity. So hearing and acknowledging the need while simultaneously saying opportunity, where to go and how do we take this forward. And I think that we're getting some great ideas and suggestions right here.
I've watched things evolve so much over this past year, and it gives me so much hope, like that Hope Project, Jackie, that you brought to my attention through the University of Alberta, doing a Hope Project in the schools, in public schools, and things are happening. Boy, this hour has gone by quickly. And before we wrap up, I'd like to sort of get final thoughts from everyone, because I know there's probably a lot going on, a lot that you've been thinking during this conversation and haven't had a chance to verbalize or vocalize. So Bethany, why don't we start with you? What would you like to leave audiences with?
One of the things that is so beautiful is this concept of resiliency, the capacity to bounce back from negative experiences and trauma. We know that we need about 7 positive experiences to counteract 1 negative one. If you've ever worked in retail and you've had like so many good customers all day, and then one person comes in at the end and it ruins everything, that's what it is. So resiliency is a fluid phenomenon. We can add to it. And that is what is so hopeful, that we know what protective factors we need. We need mentors, we need hobbies, we need that one person. We need to know that we are good at things. We need to have that mirror back at us. Those protective factors we have control over. We can pour that into our youth and into our kids to counteract the negative experiences that they are encountering just in being alive in the world, which is so beautiful. In a world of uncertainty where we don't have control over a lot, we can be pouring in some of those protective factors.
Beautifully said. Denisha.
I think for me, this has been such a great conversation, and I agree. I think we need to keep this conversation going. When it comes to relationships, I think that's key, especially the mentoring and what the preliminary data is showing right now based on the last few months of COVID. Clearly that mentoring is having a positive effect on young people and their mental health and reducing anxiety. And we're fortunate enough that we have the technology where if you can't meet in person because of restrictions, you can do it over Zoom or over Teams and virtually. So it's great to still have that platform. But I think like there's always, and I think I've talked to you about this, Leslie, there's always been a need for more volunteers, especially males, because we know women tend to step up and volunteer in the nonprofit sector in whichever area. But like in Edmonton, we have about 1,200 kids on our wait list, and 800 of them are boys because they're looking for a male role model in their lives. And short of us doing everything we can to find those people, I think we also need to have a conversation about alternatives around natural supports. So how do we support and train individuals who are in the child's life right now, like parents, caregivers, aunts, uncles, grandparents, to be that natural mentor to a child, and making sure that they have the tools that they need. So it's not always about a formal mentoring program, but I think it's about mentoring in whatever capacity that looks like.
Well, you've convinced me. I'm a real advocate for your organization anyway, but you've really helped me to see how important it is. Thank you so much.
Some of the final thoughts that I think I have are almost related to getting the youth involved. And I think, even me being here today representing the CASA Youth Council is one initiative. And I think that's very important, as we've mentioned previously, getting the youth perspective and allowing them to speak and just listening is going to be huge, room for opportunity, as well as by getting youth involved, it almost makes it accustomed in their lives. It becomes a day-to-day as opposed to, okay, this is something distinct that we're, talking about. I think with mental health, it's something that we should be addressing every day in our lives. And it shouldn't be the separate topic that, requires special attention. I think it should be something that's just as important, as much as, the things that we do in our day to day. So I think, emphasizing that along with the youth involvement, will lead to a lot of positive scope.
Boy, thank you. And final word to you, Jackie.
My final thoughts. This pandemic has had an impact on mental health. There is clear data telling us that. So this is an important conversation we have to keep having. We can't ignore it. We have to understand that our children, while they're resilient and they're amazing, they may be struggling. And we need to listen and we need to pay attention. I think that's coming out loud and clear here in our conversation. And I think that's something that we take home and think about and reflect on how we can respond to it. I think relatedly, I would want to also add that caregivers out there, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, mentors, whomever, you matter. You really matter, whatever your role is. And because you matter, you also need to take care of yourself, because this is stressful for you too. So in meeting the needs of your children and youth, you need to also meet your own needs. So finding a place and space for your own self-care and your own wellness is as important as also being there to listen to and meet your kids where they're at. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And you know, we asked a pretty big question off the top. Are they going to be okay? And you've done a really good job of answering a very, very tough question that really doesn't have an answer to it. But it's part of a progress, and I personally feel just fantastic about the future hearing all of you speak. So thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Jackie Pai, Japji, Bethany, Denisha, thank you so much. It's been a privilege having you all on this panel. And by the way, Dr. Pai was also a guest on Global News Morning Edmonton for the regular monthly feature, CASA Presents Your Mental Health. And you can catch a recording of her interview at globalnews.ca. We'd also really appreciate it if you would share your thoughts about this session by taking our survey. Just click on the link in the description below, and because your feedback is really important to us in keeping these sessions relevant, informative, and enjoyable. And finally, I mentioned earlier that CASA is a not-for-profit organization, and your support of their work with infants, children, youth, and their families is so much appreciated. To donate, please go to our website at casaservices.org and click on the Donate button. On behalf of CASA, Child, Adolescent, and Family Mental Health, thank you for joining us. I'm Leslie McDonald.